according to the UN. Though a ceasefire agreement was reached after 5 days of violence, there's no indication of any end in sight for the conflict in Gaza. Because the thing is, sadly, frustratingly, this is not a new story. As UN records show, there was the 2021 Gaza conflict that killed 261 Palestinians and 13 Israelis. The 2018 Gaza March of Return that claimed 214 Palestinian lives and 1 Israeli soldier. The 2014 Gaza war, dubbed by Israel as Operation Protective Edge, that killed 2,251 Palestinians and 73 Israelis. The 2012 Gaza war, known as Operation Pillar of Defense, that killed 168 Palestinians and 4 Israelis. And the devastating 2009 Gaza war, or Operation Cast Lead, that left 1,385 Palestinians and 4 Israelis dead. Joe Biden has been a lifelong supporter of Israel. He met with legendary Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir 50 years ago in his very first year as a senator. This week, on Wednesday, he went to Israel to hug Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to offer his and America's unyielding support to a Jewish state still reeling from a violent Hamas attack that killed more than 1,400 Israelis. And then on Thursday evening, back in the Oval Office, the president addressed the American public on the subject of U.S. support for Israel and for Israel's latest war in Gaza.
In Israel, we must make sure that they have what they need to protect their people today and always. The security package I'm sending to Congress and asking Congress to do is an unprecedented commitment to Israel's security that will sharpen Israel's qualitative military edge, which we've committed to, the qualitative military edge.
For me, though, the line that stood out on Thursday came not from Joe Biden's Oval Office speech. It came from one of Israel's top officials, a senior member of Netanyahu's security cabinet, speaking to reporters. Hostages and civilian casualties will be secondary to destroying Hamas, Economy Minister Nir Barakat told ABC News, even if it takes a year. Hold on. Saving the hostages is secondary to destroying Hamas? Shouldn't that be the main mission? There are still around 200 people being held by Hamas, according to the Israeli military, despite the freeing of 2 American hostages on Friday. And avoiding civilian casualties is also secondary to destroying Hamas? Isn't making sure civilians don't get unnecessarily killed in conflict a key part of international humanitarian law? So tonight, with an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza still looming, is this the kind of war, a year-long war perhaps, according to Israel's own top minister, that the Biden administration has really signed up for? Is this what the American public has signed up for?
It's not just been inadequate, it has been callous, indifferent and dangerous. This reached rock bottom on Friday when Ursula von der Leyen visited Israel. By then, Israel had dropped 6,000 bombs and on an area half the size of Louth. Thousands were dead and injured. Food, water and electricity supplies had been cut off. And the Israeli government had given 1.2 million people 24 hours notice to leave northern Gaza. What was the European Commission President's response to this litany of war crimes and breaches of international law? She stood with the Israeli Prime Minister and offered him the EU's unqualified and unconditional support. She said, Israel can count on the EU. Taoiseach, last year when Russia targeted civilian infrastructure and cut off electricity supplies, Ursula von der Leyen called out their war crimes. When Israel acts similarly, she not only fails to utter a single word of criticism, she goes to the region to offer support for their war crimes in our name. The Commission President's failure to unequivocally condemn Israel's collective...
But here is the point. I am very proud of being Jewish. I actually lived in Israel for some months. But what I happen to believe is that right now, sadly, tragically, in Israel, through Bibi Netanyahu, you have a reactionary racist who is now running that country. And I happen to believe that what our foreign policy in the Mideast should be about is absolutely protecting the independence and security of Israel. But you cannot ignore the suffering of the Palestinian people. We have got
Israel has breached international law, not just on every day since October the 7th, but virtually every single day for decades. Israel occupies Palestinian land against international law. Israel blockades Palestinian territory against international law. Israel builds and expands illegal settlements against international law. Israel enforces an apartheid system that restricts the movements of Palestinians and denies their fundamental rights against international law. And Israel regularly and systematically attacks and kills Palestinian civilians against international law. So the question that must be answered by all of us in political life is this: how does the world respond to flagrant abuses of international law? When it comes to the horrendous war crimes of Hamas, the response was very clear and very consistent. World leaders queued up to say Israel has the right to defend itself. One after another repeated the words, the great and the good, including our government: Israel has the right to defend itself. Repeated in statement after statement, tweet after tweet, despite the full knowledge that those words have become contaminated. The words "Israel has the right to defend itself" means in practice that Israel takes that right as license to bombard civilians, to bomb schools, hospitals and other civilian infrastructure. And it has now been taken as license to enforce the displacement of 1 million people from one end of an open-air prison to another, to deny food, energy, medical supplies to a besieged civilian population, to actually deny them water, to ensure that children, the sick, the disabled, the elderly will literally die of thirst. Israel has the right to defend itself has now become cover for Israel has the right to commit genocide right in front of our eyes.
Didn't start on the 7th of October. Do the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? Because the speak is, Israel has a right to defend itself. Did Palestine have a right to defend itself when land was taken from it, when people were dispossessed, when houses were levelled, when UN resolutions on torture, on ethnic cleansing, on apartheid? Did the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? Did they have a right to defend themselves when Israel turn on and turn off the electricity and stop food and stop medical aid long before this attack?
Well, let's let him answer, shall we?
Just one more thing, right? There are 600 Palestinian children buried under the rubble at this moment in time. There are over 500 Palestinian children dead, and there are 500 Palestinian children in jail, 150 of them minors. Hostages. The children under the rubble are hostages. The children in the jails are hostages.
You taken by surprise at this audacious operation by Hamas?
Well, surprised by what happened. I mean, no one was really expecting it, but not overly surprised by why it happened. I mean, ultimately, one of the things that I think people need to remember is that if you live in Gaza, and I was reporting there for many years and have spent time there since the last 15 or so years, for the majority of Palestinians there's 2.5 million of them roughly. It's a blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt. And that means basically you don't have freedom of movement, you can't leave when you want, you can't study outside the country very easily. And that's suffocating. And this is not a defence of Hamas by any means. I've spent time with Hamas as a reporter in Gaza, and many Gazans I know don't like Hamas particularly in the past or now. But the truth is that when you occupy a people for decades, and I say that as someone who is Jewish, I'm a Jewish German Australian, and I've reported on this issue for 20 or so years, that I am surprised by obviously the timing of this, but at the same time not at all surprised by the reasons behind it.
OK, what about the timing then? Why do you think it's happening now? What is going on internationally that's brought it to this point?
I think there's a few things going on. In the last years, there's been obviously a huge amount of Arab nations trying to so-called normalise relations with Israel, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco and others. The one at the moment that's not formally secured that relationship is Saudi Arabia, and the US has been pushing that, and Saudi of course is a major Arab state. And I think many in Hamas would feel, correctly so, that normalising relations with an occupying power is completely inappropriate. I think it shows that there is almost a power struggle of sorts for Palestinian leadership, that the Palestinian Authority, which is backed by the West and including Australia I might add, which is a thuggish, corrupt organisation that runs the West Bank nominally, although Israel ultimately is the occupying power there, has no power. Essentially, it's a contractor for Israel. And I think Hamas wants to show to Palestinians, both in Palestine and across the Arab Muslim world, that in fact they are the leaders of the Palestinian struggle. And I think also finally, obviously I can't clearly get inside Hamas's head, but I think it seems quite likely that a lot of people in the Palestinian movement, both in Australia and around the world, are so infuriated with years and years of Western silence on this. I'm talking about from Australia, US, Europe and elsewhere, that somehow there's a belief that you can lock people up, occupy them. And of course, let's not forget, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and others have called what's happening in Palestine apartheid. That's their words. Every Israeli human rights organisation has called it apartheid. If that is the case for years, and it is, and I've reported on that myself, as have other journalists, eventually people will snap. People will break. You cannot continue to behave like this as a Jewish state, a self-described moral state, and expect Palestinians simply to lie down and accept it.
Of course. I have to ask, what do you say to your fellow Israelis who say we must respond to these kind of attacks from Hamas that kill Israeli civilians like your parents with strength, with force? This is the worst attack on Israel in the country's history. We have to hit back hard. What do you say to them?
I say to them, war is not the answer. War was never the answer, and war will never be the answer. We must end this cycle of death, the cycle of blood. And me and my family, we are seeking no revenge. We are seeking no revenge. We are seeking peace, and we are seeking equality. And I'm not saying it in words, I'm crying it. I'm crying nonstop.
6,000 bombs in 6 days, 7,000 people murdered, over 3,000 children murdered. That's not defense, it's offense. And it's not war, it's genocide. A question to the leaders of the West.
I'm an Israeli, I was born in Israel. I even perceive myself as an Israeli patriot. I care about Israel, I belong to Israel, I'm attached to Israel. Guys, it's not about peace, it's not about symmetry. There is no symmetry. Forget about symmetry. Don't speak about symmetry because there is no symmetry. I would even suggest that there is no conflict. Was there a French-Algerian conflict? There was a brutal French occupation in Algeria, which came to its end. And there is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is a brutal Israeli occupation which must come to its end one way or the other. One way was the two-state solution. One way was the two-state solution. It's a fair solution. Israel did anything possible to destroy it in an irreversible way. And now we are left only with the other alternative. There's no third way.
I have seen your interview just a few days ago with the Israeli ambassador. You started that conversation with her with showing an outpouring emotions, good for you, about the mothers. Why didn't you start with me about the thousands of mothers, grandmothers,
I literally read that. I literally...
With me.
Well, Ambassador.
This is the asymmetry. This is the asymmetry.
Ambassador.
She did say here, on this seat, that they provided the whole south of Gaza as a safe zone, and they are building shelters to Palestinian civilians. She said that the south of Gaza is safe. You know how many people were killed in the south of Gaza only in the last 48 hours? So an Israeli official sits here and tells the world that the south of Gaza is safe and people should go there en masse, therefore ethnically cleansing these people to the south to actually slaughter them. And then you, Pierce, do not look her in the eye and tell her, stop lying.
There's no Hamas in the West Bank and they're still dying there. So what's your excuse?
Listen, I don't make any pretense that this hasn't been a massive problem between Palestine and Israel going back to the mid-40s. We all know this, right?
Pierce, listen. I'm not saying that you're making excuse, but if you are adopting a certain point of view, you have to at least defend it. I'm telling you, there is no Hamas in the West Bank. What is the excuse? Not your excuse. What is the excuse to kill those people?
Well, listen, this question of proportionality is one that...
No, answer my question. I've been answering your question. You answer mine.
It's actually not my job to answer your questions. It's not.
Okay, not your job.
Not.
I agree with you.
I'm more interested in you, who has family in Gaza.
We have to look at who is responsible for the death. And the responsible is only
Hamas.
Here's a question to you. 143 Palestinians at least, and the count keeps changing because Israelis keep killing more, have died since March the 30th, since the beginning of the so-called Great March of Return. 15,000 Palestinians, let's just be clear, 15,000 have been wounded. 4,000 of them, according to the United Nations, were shot with live ammunition. Are you telling us, are you telling the Oxford Union audience here, the audience at home, that those 15,000 people were all members of Hamas? Seriously?
Mary, I can look at anyone here in their eyes and say, Israel is doing its level best not to kill anyone who is not involved.
It's insane that 40 miles away from this genocide taking place, that you have Israelis going to the beach, going out to eat, just living their lives, Rania. And you have our friends and brothers and sisters on the ground in Gaza deciding, hey, should we stick together so that if a bomb hits the house, we'll all die together? Or should we separate so that one of us will live on and perhaps tell our stories and take care of our infants who won't have a family anymore?
If the American government withdraws its support for Israel and stop all military aids to the regime, Israel would not have carried out the genocide and mass murders of Palestinians with impunity.
Days after Russia launched its war in Ukraine, a video went viral. Some believed it was of a young Ukrainian girl. It appeared to show the girl defiantly standing up to a Russian soldier, her new occupier, and it was powerful. Very quickly, it was shared across social media. 8-year Ukrainian girl confronts a Russian soldier telling him to go back to his country. Brave little girl confronts invading Putin's army. #defend Ukraine. This is courage, people wrote. But that wasn't a little Ukrainian girl confronting a Russian soldier. Fact-checkers and people who knew the girl quickly noted it was actually Ahad Tamimi, an 11-year-old Palestinian girl at the time. The footage was nearly 10 years old. Ahad Tamimi was confronting Israeli soldiers in the occupied West Bank in 2012, asking them to release her 15-year-old brother, who had just been arrested. The thing is, as soon as we found out the girl defiantly standing up to an occupying military was not Ukrainian, but Palestinian, the world looked away from what her plight might have been. There could be no comparison to Ukraine, no similarity between Ukrainians who are suddenly under Russia's vicious and illegal occupation and Palestinians who have been living under a brutal Israeli military occupation for more than 5 decades.
So these Jewish settlers that live in Hebron are living under the same rights that I live in Jerusalem, but the Palestinian next to them, next house over, next building over, sometimes next apartment over, lives under my rule, my military rule. And I can do whatever I want with him. I can take his home as a temporary base for a few hours to a few days to a few weeks. I can decide that I'm arresting the people of the house and tying them up to the fence of my base. If we will get an order to demolish their home or just lock their front door and don't let them out into the street their house is on, a street that only Jewish settlers can walk on and Palestinians cannot. So they have to walk through windows to yards, into the other side, into the Kasbah of Hebron. I think realizing all of that in a very, very early stage in my service helped me understood that someone was lying to me along the way. I didn't feel like I'm protecting anyone. I didn't feel like I'm helping anyone feeling more safe. I felt like I'm terrorizing people. I feel like for the first time in my life, the boundaries between good and bad that I learned as a kid, and obviously I learned that I'm on the good side, was broken. I felt like I am the terrorist.
The killing of innocent civilians in Israel should be condemned, and we condemn it. The killing of innocent civilians in Palestine should also be condemned, and we must condemn it. The international community loudly and proudly condemned Russia's occupation of Ukraine when it started attacking Ukraine in 2014. Yet today, the world watches as the State of Israel deprives the entire population, men, women, and children, of the basic necessities of life: food, water, electricity, gas, and medicines. We must condemn it. Israeli missiles strike residential dwellings, civilians, multi-story apartments, health facilities, as well as places of worship, indiscriminately killing men, women, and children. We must condemn it. Human Rights Watch confirms that Israel is using white phosphorus in Gaza, violates the international humanitarian law prohibition. We must condemn it. The price tag of Israel's right to defend itself cannot be the destruction of Palestine. Israel's right to defend its civilians cannot equate to the annihilation of Palestinian civilians. I hereby call for an immediate ceasefire to come into effect, alongside many world leaders and experts. Food, water, medicine, and humanitarian aid needs to be allowed to get through and reach the victims.
So right now, if you are putting out a statement talking about how your heart goes out to the hostages in Israel, but you are not saying that your heart goes out to the people, the civilians, the children of Gaza, if you are condemning Hamas, but you are not simultaneously condemning the Israeli government and the U.S.'s unconditional support for the Israeli government as they are bombing civilians in Gaza, as they have cut off food and electricity to a city that is over 50% children because of the extremely low life expectancy rate there, because people there are suffering under the worst form of apartheid in the world's largest open-air prison and constantly are experiencing violence at the hands of the Israeli army. If you didn't give a shit what was happening in Palestine up until 2 days ago, that is because you see Israelis as people and you do not see Palestinians as people.
Hamas's hostage taking, their hostage taking of children, of the disabled, elderly civilians are a war crime. But when we are talking about the blockading of water, food, electricity, to a population of 2.2 million Palestinians. When we are talking about dropping what we're seeing from Human Rights Watch, reports and confirmation from organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, the dropping and deployment of white phosphorus, which is also a war crime. It is unacceptable to think that 1,700 Palestinian children alone, that their deaths will somehow make up for or justify the violence of what we saw on October 7th.
You know, 158,967 Palestinians killed or injured between 2008 and September of 2023, as compared to 6,615 Israelis. Their land is stolen on a regular basis.
But the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, their right to justice, must also be recognized. And put yourself in their shoes. Look at the world through their eyes. It is not fair that a Palestinian child cannot grow up in a state of their own, living their entire lives with the presence of a foreign army that controls the movements, not just of those young people, but their parents, their grandparents, every single day. It's not just when settler violence against Palestinians goes unpunished. It's not right to prevent Palestinians from farming their lands or restricting a student's ability to move around the West Bank or displace Palestinian families from their homes. Neither occupation nor expulsion is the answer. Just as Israelis built a state in their homeland, Palestinians have a right to be a free people in their own land.